everyone doing? Good. Thanks for coming. Anybody here yesterday for the opening? As you all know, we got a big show in the gallery. If you didn't see it on your way in, stop on your way out. We're blessed to have Frank back today. He was here yesterday and gave a talk about, I believe it was entitled 1,000 Years of Peebles. Today we're getting a little bit more specific. We're going to be talking about the context. So thank you, Frank, for being here. And let's give Frank a warm welcome.
Okay, first caveat is that I'm not an Americanist. My studies in Philadelphia have been because I live here. So this is a little different kind of talk than what we had yesterday. I also want to apologize for anybody who expected to hear a whole hour on the Centennial Exhibition. I'm going to talk about it, but not that much. So I decided to put those remarks into a broader context and talk about the history of tea in Philadelphia, which is a long and complicated history, in fact. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement that is to say just to note that the place where we are right now and Philadelphia area in general were part of Lenapehoking, forgive my pronunciation, land occupied by indigenous people who continue to exist as tribes, though not in this area anymore. The reason I mention that is that while we don't think they drank tea per se, because tea plants were not indigenous to North America, we do suspect that we're pretty sure that they drank various kinds of herbs decocted in hot water. So they had that kind of tea, but not real tea. So when the first Europeans arrived in the area, first is Henry Hudson and his visit in 1600. He didn't stay for very long. However, that leads to the New Amsterdam Dutch colony, where, again, we have no specific records of tea for these people. But we do know that by that time, the Dutch East India Company was bringing tea back from Indonesia and China as well as India. So it's very likely that the Dutch settlers did have tea, even though we have no specific records of it. The Swedish settlers who came and established Fort Christiana in Delaware probably were drinking coffee rather than tea. But by the 1640s, we have the arrival of English settlers, and they were drinking tea. Not necessarily tea from Japan, not likely tea from Japan, probably tea from India and Indonesia, Southeast Asia. The first English settlement in the 1640s basically failed, and was driven out by the Dutch and the Swedish. But the English came back, and by the 1680s, they had taken over the lands that the Dutch and the Swedish had occupied. Not that the Dutch and the Swedish left, but political control went over to the Brits. That happened in the 1660s. In 1682, this area was ceded by charter to William Penn, and that marks the foundation of the colony of Pennsylvania. He, of course, was a tea drinker, and so we know that tea was drunk in the colony by the British. So much so that the British felt they could put a tax on it. There were several informal taxations, and then in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, insisting that every carton of tea sent to the American colonies had a special tax on it that was different from the tax on tea in Britain itself. The Americans didn't like that and began to protest against it as early as the 1760s. Certainly by the 1770s, when the British passed the Tea Act, strengthening that tax on tea. And the idea was that by putting a higher tax on tea, they were actually going to regulate the price of tea in the colony. And it was an attempt to thwart smugglers who were bringing in tea without paying the British taxes. In any case, the Americans protested against it. The famous example that we all know is the Boston Tea Party in early December of 1773. About 30 men dressed as Native Americans went on board a British tea vessel and threw 39 crates of tea into the harbor. It was a violent act of incursion onto that British vessel and destroying British property. But while that tea party is famous, what's less famous is the Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia version of the Tea Party. It happens a little bit later. In December of 1773, a British shipment of tea comes aboard the tea ship Polly, and Pennsylvania, Philadelphia settlers knew that it was coming. When the pilot was sent to bring the ship up the Delaware, he decided to stop at Chester before coming up to Philadelphia per se. That's because he had already received threats from the protesting committee's protesters, threatening him with tarring and feathering, practice used on violent criminals, where they were coated with tar and covered with feathers, and it was a very painful kind of punishment. Not only was the captain of the Polly threatened with that treatment, any pilot who would bring the ship up the river to Philadelphia was threatened with the same treatment. And those threats had been publicized as early as October of 1773. And they were effective. When the ship arrived in Chester, word soon came up to Philadelphia that it was there and it was coming to Philly. And on the 27th, it arrived in Chester on the 25th, on Christmas Day of 1773. On the 27th, 8,000 protesters showed up at the port of Philadelphia to prevent its docking. That was the biggest show of support for the American colonies and against the British taxation up to that point. And it was cited as part of the inspiration for the Continental Congress the next year, and was one of the reasons why Philadelphia became the center of revolutionary activity. And we all know how the story plays out from there. The ship was refused admission to Philadelphia. It went up the coast and tried to stop in Massachusetts and was refused admission there, and ultimately ends up going back to Britain. We can characterize this Philadelphia Tea Party as being less violent, but far more effective than the Boston Tea Party was. The rhetoric of taxation without representation becomes a part of the mantra of the revolutionaries as they move into the Revolutionary War in the next couple of years. Okay. Fast forward 100 years. America, meanwhile, has gone through its own import of tea to steep and drink. Both British tea, Chinese tea, and a little bit of Japanese tea by the 1870s. In 1876, they hold the Centennial Exhibition at Fairmount Park. It's a huge display on from May until November of 1876. Visited by nearly 10 million people. If you think about it, that's 1/5 of the population of the whole country. So it was a huge success. 37 countries participated, including Japan, which for the first time has its own pavilion at the fair. That pavilion is in two parts. The Japanese bazaar, where many different kinds of goods were sold, including bronze sculptures, ceramics, textiles, fabrics, and most importantly for our discussion today, tea. This was green tea made to be steeped, and it was sold in the Japanese bazaar, which had been built by Japanese workmen who came and lived there. There's also a crew that stayed on through the fair to make tea. They were not making matcha. This is all sencha steeped tea. And probably not very good by today's standard. We know, for example, that they actually included indigo in the processing of the tea to make it greener, to make it look distinguish it in that sense from the black tea of the British tradition. The area also included the first Japanese garden in the United States, one of the first Japanese gardens ever built outside of Japan. And I can't give you exact numbers, but it's said that the biggest sales item at the bazaar, bigger than the bobbleheads, bigger than the ceramics, bigger than the paintings, was tea. We also know that they had free samples of tea, so it was a big deal. It was a major part of the exhibition. Fast forward a mere 50 years, and Philadelphia Museum of Art, for reasons that I don't completely understand, decided to purchase a tea house designed and built by Ogi Godot in the teens, and to bring it to Philadelphia with the intention of installing it in the galleries. It was purchased in the late 1920s. It actually arrived in Philadelphia in 1928, but was not installed and open to the public until the 1950s. So installed and opened in 1957. I suspect that that was inspired in part by the success of the Japanese house at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. More on that later. In any case, in the 50s, this was installed as pretty much as it is today. There were a few tea events surrounding that in 57, but then it fell out of use and was simply there to be viewed from 57 until the 1990s, when we began to use it periodically for tea events, usually for the visits of tea grandmasters from Japan. And so it's been used half a dozen times since the 1990s for those kinds of visits. And it's going to be used again, I understand, on next Sunday for an event related to our International Tea Bowl exhibition. The complex consists of a house, a tea house, and a waiting room. So you have the waiting area, the tea house itself, and a mizuya, preparation area. The name of the building was decided by Ogi, the builder. It is a reference to a line from the Zhuangzi Taoist text of the 1st, 2nd century of the Common Era, which says that even a worm that's only an inch long can experience joy. So, Sun Karaku, Sun reference to the inch-long worm, Karaku can experience joy. The museum translates that as the House of Evanescent Joys. I think it's a good name, inscribed over the entrance. garden, as installed, was designed by Tatsui Matsunosuke. I don't know very much about him. He was born in 1894, so part of his mature career. So, back to the inspiration for this. In the Japanese house that was built and installed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, both designed in 1952 and 3, built in Nagoya, Japan, brought to the United States and installed at the Museum of Modern Art, where it stood until 1954, 55. In the year and a half or so that it was open in New York, it received over 250,000 visitors. It was hugely popular. People stood in line around the block to get into the Museum of Modern Art to see it. It inspired magazine articles, fashion shoots, book sections, a lot of attention. And then the Museum of Modern Art decided that it wanted its courtyard back. And after a lot of discussion and a lot of consideration, it was moved to Philadelphia, where it opened in 1958. So I think that all of that hoopla around this house that was in New York inspired the Philadelphia Museum of Art to pull its tea house out of storage and actually install it. It was also one of the first, the Tea House Inn and Art Museum was one of the first cases where a building was displayed within a building of an art museum. So, Shofuso was brought from New York to Philadelphia, and whether there were tea demonstrations or not in Philadelphia, I don't know until the 1970s. There was a lot of tea equipment that came with the house to New York. Some of it donated by Omote Senke, some of it donated by Uro Senke, who were both involved in the house being built and brought to the United States. So it came to Philadelphia in the late 1950s. There's a whole lot more history there that I'm not going to bore you with today. But it includes a tea house designed by Yoshimura Junzo. And that strangely for a tea house has no name. So it's just the tea house of Shofuso. I hope to remedy that someday before it's on my bucket list. Let's put that. During the bicentennial in 1876, Philadelphia was, of course, the scene of many, many activities, celebrations of that 200th anniversary of the founding of our country. In the lead up to that, the Japan Foundation restored Shofuso, which had fallen into some disrepair, by, for example, putting a new roof on it and repairing various parts that had become broken. And in order to respond to that, the city hired a number of people, Japanese Americans, to perform tea ceremony demonstrations at the house during that bicentennial celebration. One of the people they hired to do that was this woman, Taiko Sherman, who is still with us and involved in tea in Philadelphia, although she has returned to Japan to live. Taiko Sensei was one of the young women hired to perform these ceremony demonstrations, and as part of that also began to train the staff of Shofuso that had been hired by the city to show it off to visitors during the bicentennial. She began to teach that staff how to demonstrate tea, how to make tea. This, of course, is matcha. Urasenke branch of the tea school that was working there. After the bicentennial ended, Taiko and other Japanese American families and non-Japanese Americans as well formed the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, a non-profit organization that after a few years was able to lease the house from the city in order to present it to the public. And as part of their activities had tea ceremony demonstrations from the beginning of their foundation in the 1970s. These settled in when I was director in the 1990s. We had basically monthly demonstrations of tea in the house during the warmer months of the year when it was open. Those demonstrations continue to the present day, and at the very least we can say that thousands of people have seen tea performed in the house, and in many, many cases been able to taste the tea and get a sense of what matcha tea is like. This is a picture of Taiko Sensei preparing for one of our other demonstrations, a moon viewing tea, something we still try to do every year for members of the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden. And that leads us to leap forward another half century to the foundation of the International Tea Bowl exhibitions here at the Wallingford Community Arts Center. And that sort of, I hope, brings our history of tea in Philadelphia full circle. There's a lot more that could be said, and I'm happy to try to answer questions about it. But thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the kind of questions and discussion that we had yesterday after talking about the history of tea bowls. So here we are. Any questions, comments?
You had mentioned that much of the tea at the Centennial came from places other than Japan. Was that because trade with Japan was still fairly limited, or was there another reason for it?
Trade with Japan was lively at that point. The tea from other places, the whole purpose of the bicentennial, in some senses, the whole purpose of the Centennial exhibition was as an industrial exhibit. So countries were sending their industrial products, including tea, as part of their displays. The Chinese participation was much smaller than the Japanese, and while tea was included in their products, it was not nearly as, shall we say, successful as the Japanese tea, which was kind of the hit of the show, and really became popular as a result.
You mentioned also tea from India and Southeast Asia.
Right. That was mostly black tea, British style tea. They were all there. But the green tea from Japan was very popular. It had been introduced to the U.S. a few years earlier, specifically coming through San Francisco. That Centennial Exposition was important for a whole lot of other reasons. People, including Frank Lloyd Wright, came to the show and saw the Japanese buildings and were inspired by them. Many other visitors came. Edward Morse, who's an important collector. The young Charles Lang Freer, who ends up being the collector whose collection founds the basis for the National Museum of Asian Art at the Smithsonian. It also might be noted that a number of the other pieces, for example, the bronze sculptures from the Japanese bazaar, ended up in large measure at Smithsonian, while there was an important purchase of ceramics by the Kensington Museum in London, that today is known as the Victoria and Albert Museum. And of course, Ed Morse saw things there that then later, when he went to Japan, he acquired a lot of ceramics that are now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So it's an important milestone, really, in the American appreciation of Japanese culture.
How old was the Smithsonian back then? Because Smithsonian came from England.
The Smithsonian was just getting started at that point. I think it had been founded a few years earlier, but its collection of Asian art was not incorporated into the collection until around 1900, when Freer's collection moves to the Smithsonian. Question in the back?
You mentioned that the tea itself at the Centennial Exhibition was not very good.
I think by our standards today, we wouldn't have thought it was very good. The reason being that today we're used to tea that's processed and then vacuum packed and sometimes even freeze dried or preserved by keeping it cold. And of course, they didn't have vacuum packaging. They didn't have refrigeration equipment. The tea got very dried out, and like I say, there are records of blue dye being added to the Japanese tea because Americans thought green tea should look green, even though in fact it's more brownish tone if you look at the leaves of green tea.
Was it dangerous to add indigo to the tea for consumption?
I think so.
Yeah.
Although indigo is not poisonous,
Okay.
it doesn't taste very good.
But then, despite all of extremely popular at
It was-
the Centennial.
It was very popular. I think it had a brighter taste than English style black tea.
Okay.
I'm a person who prefers sencha green tea to English style black tea, although I drink that as well. I think it has more of a tea flavor. And so much English style tea has, additives to give it other flavors. Earl Grey tea is a primary example with its seeds.
With Shokuso, when it was at MoMA, you mentioned that Urasenke and Motosenke had donated some utensils, some work. Is there anything in the record that shows tea itself was served at that time? Were visitors to MoMA Shokuso enjoy tea, or was that something that they could first experience at Shokuso in Philadelphia?
The record I know of is that as part of the opening celebration, when it was first opened, there was a tea ceremony performed. But I don't know whether that involved ordinary visitors or whether it was just tea served to the dignitaries at the event. Many things I could do more research on. In the back.
Yeah. So I was just curious, after the Philadelphia Tea Party and the Boston Tea Party, how long did it take before the Americans actually started importing their own tea? And where did they get it from?
Let me first say I don't know exactly. I know they were importing tea from China as early as around 1800. That American vessels were going again from the California side. I suspect there were Americans importing tea directly from India after 1812 or so. But there again, I have to do more research. It's not exactly my field, as we say. There was also a move after 1776, after the Declaration of Independence. There was pressure placed on Americans to drink coffee rather than tea. And the coffee, of course, came from Africa, imported by French and Belgian and Dutch companies. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
That's okay, I've just heard
Olives.
the Bostonians still don't like tea because they, still associate it with British rule. So,
Right.
just wondering if that was different in Philadelphia.
I think you'd have to ask Ben Franklin what he drank. I'm not sure.
Thank you for this informative talk. It's really a great learning experience. I know the title is The History of Tea in Philadelphia. You were such an integral part of it. How did you encounter tea and what drove you to it? I know it's a long story.
That's another
In
one.
a few words, maybe.
Well, I grew up drinking coffee like most Americans, and like most graduate students, could not have possibly survived graduate school without the caffeine of coffee. But I began drinking tea alongside coffee again when I was in high school and college. One of my undergraduate classes involved the study of Japanese culture. It was a general introduction to Japanese culture, and one of the things the teacher served to us at some point was matcha tea. I recall liking it, thinking it was interesting. I then, as a graduate student, working on Japanese culture, particularly looking at Japanese prints, one of the things I began to study was Japanese ceramics, and in particular, I was convinced by the director of the Kansas City's big Museum of Art's Nelson Gallery, because I was studying Japanese language and so forth. I went to the Nelson for a curatorial seminar, and the director pointed to a locker, if you will, and he said, "These are our Japanese tea bowls. I want you to figure them out, and after you figure them out, I'll show you the curatorial records." So there were some 30 tea bowls. Fortunately, most of them in their wooden boxes, so there was some information on them in any case. And out of 30 tea bowls, my paper, which ran to 80 pages, which is pretty long for a seminar paper, I got 28 right and 2 wrong. The 2 wrong turned out to be Korean tea bowls. And since he had called them Japanese tea bowls, it was confusing, but
Trick question.
yeah, it was a trick question, indeed. And he was famous for trick questions. He would show people fakes, and he would show particularly to graduate students. I had a friend who wrote a whole seminar paper on what turned out to be a fake Chinese Buddhist sculpture. That's another story. In any case, I discovered those tea bowls, and then when I went to Japan to continue to study Japanese language and to teach English, right in my neighborhood there was a Japanese tea teacher from Urasenke, and her son was one of my students. I mentioned to him that I was interested in studying Japanese culture, and he said, "Why don't you come to study tea with my mother?" I now think of her as my Japanese mother, and still go to see her whenever I visit Japan, although she's in her 90s now. But she's still happy to see me, I think. She still recognized us last time we saw her. And that got me interested in studying tea as a discipline. The humorous version of it is that I went to tea lessons because I liked the tea and I liked the discipline of studying it. My wife went with me because she liked the sweets. Although I like the sweets too. So I studied tea with that teacher for about 6 or 7 years, and then came back and studied some more in the United States with teachers in Seattle, where I finished my PhD work that had nothing to do with tea, basically. But I studied tea there at that time, and I've been involved in tea practice in some ways ever since. It was helpful to be at Shofuso as the director there, and to work with Taiko Sherman and the other tea people there. And I still work with both the Japanese House and Garden folks and the Urasenkei Tankokai today. Long story, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, I hope you enjoyed the exhibition downstairs. I'll come down for a few minutes and wander around. I'm trying hard to look only at the ones that already have a red dot, because my wife says if I bring home another tea roll, I'm going to have to build another cabinet to prove it. In the back.
How big is your collection?
Oh,
If you don't mind my asking.
at last count, I have about 300 sake cups, about 50 tea bowls, maybe 48, something like that, and a full closet of tea equipment. We also have a tea room in our 1904 house in West Philadelphia. So we took the smallest of the bedrooms and converted it to a tea room with tatami and so forth. And while I don't practice tea nearly as often as I should, I still try to enjoy a bowl of matcha every now and then. And particularly when my students from the University of Pennsylvania come over at the end of each term, I have a party inviting them over to look at the kinds of things that we've studied over the term. And I always like to include them in having some tea. Does that?
Yes, thank you.
I have two quick questions. I missed the beginning of the lecture, but in general, I just walked around downstairs and I'm wondering if all of these tea bowl makers are contemporary potters that are working now. And my second question is, how old is your oldest tea bowl? And where'd you get it?
Okay. I think all the bowls downstairs are contemporary or near contemporary. Most of them, I think, are from living potters, although there are some. Mark or Paul could probably tell you a lot more about that. I think there are some bowls actually from Japan and other places I know there were in the last exhibition. What is my oldest tea bowl? It's hard to be sure because some of them come from roundabout sources. I have one that is Annamware, comes from the southern border of China, and I suspect dates to the late 17th century. I have a couple of others that I think are Joseon Korean bowls, as far as I can tell. And then I have modern imitations or recreations of Koryo 12th century celadon. But that's a modern bowl, but in the style of 12th century. I have a Junware bowl that's a modern recreation of an 11th century Chinese tea bowl. I have an 18th century porcelain bowl that I no longer use because its condition is just not good enough to really make tea in. And then I have one that I picked up at a temple, like a rummage sale in a temple courtyard, that I think stands a chance of really being a Chosun 17th or 18th century, what we call a Yamajawan, mountain tea bowl, very informal bowl, probably made to be a rice bowl in Korea, but then you imported into Japan and used as a tea bowl ever since. But most of my bowls are modern. I have some that I purchased from modern potters directly, including Arakawa Jozan, who's an Oribe style potter. And I have a Nakazato from before he became a national treasure. Now that he's a national treasure, I couldn't touch his stuff. I don't have that kind of money. College professors just don't make that much. If that answers your question. Anyway, enjoy the exhibition downstairs. I'm happy to answer more questions one-on-one as we move through the afternoon.
Thank you. So, I would like to say thank you again for this wonderful lecture, not only today, but yesterday as well for the opening reception. Some of you were there, some of our artists were there. And as you might know, we have very active program series accompanying the exhibition with lectures, with tea presentations on Saturdays as well as Sundays. So today is Sunday. We have casual matcha being offered downstairs. So take a moment to have some tea with us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Being sponsored with the exhibition.
Stand right here for you. It's gonna make it work.
Should have put my coat on.
Oh, that would have been a great idea.
It's after Paul.
In France, she's putting also just in the workshop at the end of the week.
Oh.
So we're kind of
Nice to meet you. I'm Chilton.
a beautiful pieces actually. If you have a chance downstairs, on display.
The True History of Tea? That's Victor Rayer's book. Yeah. The other one is Victor Rayer. He's my colleague at Penn. I bet in each chapter on Japanese tea.